There are many words you could use to describe an apostle and their pseudo-spawns. Disgusting, monstrous, abominable, but tragic is not one word we would usually associate with them. Yet, that's the one that comes to mind when we think of these pesky little elves. We've already touched on their creator's life and how it's a Shakespearean tragedy unto itself. You can find out more on that by checking out our Rosine anatomy video, but somehow, the lives of these little elves right here are even worse than hers. Because yes, Rosine was misled into becoming an apostle, but her elves didn't have much of a choice, and she turned them into nightmares that terrorized every village bordering the Misty Valley. But are her pseudo-spawns really elves? And what makes them one of the most disturbing creatures in all of Berserk? Let's find out as we take a look at their unique anatomy. Who are Rosines Elves? Why were they made? Just like Rosine, her elves were children as well, which already puts a glaring red flag over their existence. Apostles are usually adults, and so are their pseudos. Rosine has adult pseudo-apostles as well, in the form of her guardian beast insects, but if she wanted to become a true elf queen, she needed subjects. And not just any kind of subjects, the kind that would listen to her every command and cater to her every whim. A huge reason for Rosine becoming an apostle was her hatred of how adults went about playing the game of life. Her experiences with her family had led her to believe that things like war and degradation were all adult activities. She wanted a kingdom where she could frolic and play with people who understood her child's heart. So, when she became an apostle, she started kidnapping children that were close to her age or even younger. The first few elves she stole, she must have done so personally, but as her army grew, she started delegating that work out to them. And she didn't stick to stealing children from her village alone. Rosine went kid shopping across every village and township that was near the Misty Valley, and soon had herself hundreds of courtiers who were ready to serve at her beck and call. Over time, this became such a problem that the people of the region started fearing elves, which is why when Guts enters Jill's village in chapter 79, he's attacked for having Puck in his hand. Are Rosines Elves really elves? What are the major differences between them? In chapter 98, we learn why people think Rosine's pseudo-apostles are elves, and to be fair to them, we'd have thought the same had we not been acquainted with Puck since day one. Jill describes the creatures terrorizing the people as being small, having glowing bodies, insect wings on their backs, and looking like little people. Guts says that's a perfect match for the way Puck looks, and the chestnut himself is horrified at being called a harmful bug. But Jill steps in to clear him by claiming their behavior wasn't elf-like. When Guts and Puck were first chased out of the village, the swordsman asked the elf if his kind was known for destroying crops and livestock, and Puck was offended by the suggestion. He said that elves would mischievously steal a cow or two here and there, but nothing to the level that it would enrage humans in such a way. The pair remained confused about the villagers' behavior until Jill told them that these elves didn't steal livestock, they stole children. And whenever they showed up, they would leave a massacre behind, eating their way through dogs, pigs, horses, donkeys, and yes, even people. This was the most shocking part for Puck, and what convinced Guts this couldn't be the work of elves. That particular suspicion was confirmed on cue when a bunch of Rosines elves flew past the windmill he was sheltering himself within, and his brand of sacrifice started bleeding. Now, Guts' brand doesn't react that way to anything but demonic entities. He's been with Puck for a while, and his brand has never bled in the elf's presence. It faintly itched when he was with Flora, but the sensation was entirely different from the one he feels when an apostle is nearby. Also, there are many visual differences between Rosines elves and regular elves, the biggest one being their many insect-like features. Rosines elves have antennae, 2 massive compound eyes, and 3 ocelli on their foreheads, much like a wasp or a hornet. They have a pair of ancillary insect legs dangling off the stingers on their lower backs that are reminiscent of bees. Regular elves have none of these features. Plus their eyes have human eyeballs, not creepy black insect ones. And, lest we forget, they don't eat people, which is a defining character trait of any entity connected to apostles or demon kind in general. So yes, while Rosine's elves look like real elves from a distance, a closer look would immediately tell you that that's not the case. And if that didn't do it, then a quick assessment of their actions certainly would. But looking like elves is one thing. Do Rosine's elves have elfin powers? And if not, what are their powers exactly? Do Rosine's elves have powers like normal elves? Their murder hornet transformation explained. Now, considering who they're modeled after, of course Rosine's elves have some elfin abilities. The first one is pretty obvious, flight. Rosine's elves possess wings similar in design to actual elves, which allows them to fly through the skies at a surprisingly rapid pace. The second elfin power they possess is the ability to make their bodies glow. Elves naturally emit a certain glow, which they can also concentrate in their bodies to blind someone in case they need to create an opening or get away in a pinch. This ability is dubbed Puck Spark by everyone's favorite elf, but Rosine's elves don't glow like that. Their glow is more of the generic glow that's associated with elves appearing in the night sky, which pretty much surrounds Puck's body at all times from a technical standpoint. But these two things are the only powers shared by actual elves and Rosines Elves. Everything else about them is completely different. Rosines Elves cannot produce elf dust, for instance. Elves usually rub their wings together and produce a magical dust which has amazing healing properties. Because Rosines Elves aren't really elves, they can't create elf dust. Nor can they sense other people's feelings, considering both Puck and Ivalira are empaths. So if they can't heal their comrades and they can't sense others' emotions, and they can't even glow all that well, what can they do? As it turns out, the main power of Rosines Elves is transformation, though they retain the characteristics of their release state in their base form as well. In chapter 98, we see Rosines Elves show up for a recruitment drive, and we start to understand why those villagers are so scared of Puck. These elves are grilled up like Kanye West because, like titanium, their teeth can chew through anything. They clean up dogs, pigs, thick wooden doors, and humans, down to the last bone, all with their mouths. And usually, that's enough to get the job done. Because the elves attack in swarms, regular people don't even try to oppose them. Who wants to be lunch for cannibal fairies, right? But when someone like Guts shows up to interrupt their playtime, Rosines Elves show their true forms. And turns out, they aren't cannibal elves, they're cannibal murder hornets posing as elves. Well, murder hornets and wasps to be precise. When Rosines Elves get bored, they stop making light of the situation and go in for the kill. And in order to do that, they assume their real forms, in which their lower bodies remain the same, but their upper bodies no longer resemble an elf's. Instead, they're replaced with the abdomen and stinger of a wasp or hornet, and so are the rest of their upper body features. These nasty double mouths have killed countless parents and livestock, we're sure of it, and the fact that their release state gives them greater strength and agility only makes them that much more of a pest. The stingers on their backs aren't just for show either. They can put those things to nasty use when they want to, and we'll address that in a couple of sections. Individually, they wouldn't be much of a problem. Hell, Guts swats about a dozen of them to death with Dragon Slayer's flat side when he first encounters them, but it's their numbers, and the fact that they can eat through pretty much anything that makes them one of the deadliest pseudo-apostles in the entire series. Rosines Elves are the definition of strength in numbers. Individually, these bugs aren't too much of a threat if you can move faster than them and have a sturdy enough swatter on hand, but when scores upon scores of them swarm you and eat their way through your body from 100 different directions simultaneously, there isn't much you can do to protect yourself. Now, is there? Guts is able to deal with them efficiently because he's spent his entire life on the battlefield, and for the last couple of years, all he has done is hunt down and kill apostles. Whenever he faces off against Rosines Elves, it's pretty much a one-sided affair, because Guts obliterates them each time. In their first encounter, he lured all of the elves pursuing him into a barn and then blew the barn up, killing them all in a single shot. The second time he comes up against a swarm of them, he torches the environment around them because fire insta-kills these bugs. So, in the grand scheme of things, Rosines Elves are likely the weakest pseudo-apostles in all of Berserk, but only a man with Guts' experience can deal with them that effortlessly. Jill's father was a soldier as well, and so were many of the men that lived in her village, and yet they cowered alongside the women and children when the elves came calling. The old and the young alike were terrified of these abominations, and thus they were allowed to run rampant. To square up against a horde of glowing elves that chomp through cows as if they were made of paper, that's something only a madman could do. And luckily for these guys, Guts was batshit crazy during his Black Swordsman era. Now that we've addressed the transformation process and the actual anatomical abilities of these guys, let's talk about how they're created, because it is downright nauseating to witness. How does Rosine create her elves? The most disgusting pseudo-apostle creation process ever. For the most part, whenever an apostle creates a pseudo, they tend to use some sort of transference technique. This is because pseudo-apostles are basically apostles within apostles. Basically, they are to apostles what the apostles are to the God Hand, thus making them natural inferiors to their own creators. Now, oftentimes, apostles that create pseudos will make them in their own likeness. You guys have seen our video on Zondark, right? That guy looks more and more like the slug count the more he takes damage. Rosine's pseudo-apostles continue the insect trend that Miura established for her design, as her guardians take the forms of various centipedes, beetles, and mantises, while her elves are all hornets and wasps. Rosine herself is based on a lunar moth's design, so clearly, Miura was playing with insect worlds when he wrote this section of the manga. That might explain why he gave Rosine's elves the creepiest creation process out of every pseudo-apostle we've seen so far. The slug counts process was fairly disgusting. He used a parasite that has his likeness etched on its face and also lived within him until such a time when its services were required. When that time came, this parasite climbed out of the count's body and enters the body of the person that had been chosen to become his pseudo-slave through their oral cavity and turns them into a superpowered thrall to the slug apostle. The egg of the perfect world does it quick and painless. He uses one of his stingers to inject the power of evil into whoever he wants to turn into a pseudo, and then things develop from there. Ganishka simply stepped on his pseudos to spawn them from his feet, but the common denominator in all three of these creation processes is the fact that the apostle had a mechanism for imparting a portion of their power of evil unto their chosen. Rosine's process is unique in that it is neither instantaneous nor is it rooted within her own body. For you see, the elf queen uses cocoons to incubate the kids she kidnaps, turning them into the elves that she desires. In chapter 110, Jill and Puck come across a part of the Misty Valley covered in cocoons. Why they were there is something we'll address in the next section, along with that other thing we still haven't touched on, so stay tuned for that. When they first encounter the cocoons, Puck's adorable elf brain thinks there's some kind of fruit. Then he touches one of them and it becomes evident that he's completely wrong because nothing inside a fruit would ever move. And whatever Puck just touched had a lot of movement on the inside. He realized that all of those massive fruits were actually cocoons. And then, to prove him right, an elf bursts out as if on cue. Rosine pulls up on the escaping pair and explains that these were the emergence grounds, where captured human children were transformed into elves. Turns out, Rosine takes a rather elaborate method for creating her pseudo-apostles, and this could have something to do with their numbers. She personally produces a bunch of silky threads that wrap her intended elves in that aforementioned cocoon, within which they're kept in a dreamlike state, being shown everything the Misty Valley was promised it would be. On the outside, their bodies are covered with a fluid that slowly transforms their physiology from a humans to a pseudo-apostles. If, for some reason, a cocoon is broken in the middle of a transformation, the child dies, and their body disintegrates in a gooey mess of fluid, flesh, and bone. The reason Rosine has to take such an extensive approach to creating the elves could have something to do with the amount of energy involved in creating them. While we've never seen a pseudo-apostle's creation drain the creator, it's likely that it can do so if the scale is massive enough. With Slug Count, he only ever made the one, so he was fresh as a daisy afterwards. The egg of the perfect world rarely did anything but manipulate events to lead to the incarnation ceremony, and he too created 7 of them at best. Ganishka made countless pseudo-spawns, but he was being powered by the Abyss directly and had transcended apostle status by then. He basically had an endless supply of evil energy. Rosine is the only apostle outside of Ganishka that has created more than a half a dozen apostles at the same time, so it's likely that the process would take too much of her energy if she just directly injected folks and turned them into pseudos. There's also the possibility that because her elves are children, they need to be put through such an extensive process for change. It could be that children's bodies simply cannot withstand the force of evil energy without a medium, and the fluid in Rosine's cocoons acts as that medium. But speaking of those kids, that'll bring us to the final section of this video, and why you'll probably never see any of this animated. What makes Rosines Elves the most disturbing characters in Berserk? The fact that these pseudo-apostles are children is probably reason enough that no network would ever want to air the Lost Children arc in its entirety. Major edits would be required to the source material to make it palatable to any viewing audience because Rosines Elves are involved in one of Berserk's most gut-churning chapters, Chapter 109. Throughout this video, we've spoken extensively about the fact that Rosines Elves being children makes their existence as pseudos twice as abominable. Apostles are a desecration of humanity itself. These demonic reincarnates forego the natural law of life and force themselves back into the world only to spread chaos and destruction within it. The fact that little kids with no real choice in the matter were forced to become such evil creatures is something even Guts can't not feel guilty about. But where it gets even worse is when you realize their mentality, which is basically taking a distorted perception of what adulthood is to such an extreme that there's no coming back. Like we told you at the beginning of this video, Rosine became an apostle because she hated the way the world of adults worked, and she wished she could remain a child forever. Her dream of becoming an elf was something that stayed with her as long as she was a human, and when she became an apostle, it too became a reality. But in order to preserve this new reality, she couldn't be surrounding herself with adults who would just recreate the traumas of her childhood. Rosine's entire existence as an apostle is based around mocking humans, and especially adults. She thinks her Misty Valley is a place where joy and play are endless, and where, without humans, she and her elves can really go all out. But that also includes playing a very real rendition of the game of war, with very real casualties and very traumatic developments occurring within the same. In chapter 109, we see Rosine give Jill the hard pitch for becoming one of her apostles. She tells her that she can do whatever her heart desires, and she would never have to return to the misery of their old village if she just agreed to become a pseudo-apostle. Rosine was willing to make an exception for Jill. She could have made her similar to herself instead of turning her into a regular Hornet elf. She has that power as the creator of all of her pseudos. But after making that sales pitch, she should have also thought about delaying that day's war games, because otherwise Jill might have actually agreed. Rosines Elves used dragonflies as mounts and broken beetle claws as swords, and fashioned spears of their own to create a scene of death that convinced Jill she didn't want to become an elf after all. These tiny little creatures became demons upon meeting their enemies, skewering them with spear tips and holding up the bodies like crazed pagans. Those who tried to escape were pinned down and adult attacked with the stinger of the assaulter in their released state, which always left the victim bloody and broken. After the slaughter was finished, the victors would enjoy the spoils by dining on the body parts of their fallen former kinsmen, which would have reverted to their human forms shortly after their deaths. This is the reason Rosines Elves are the most disturbing pseudo-apostles in all of Berserk, because they're a reflection of her own twisted take on adults and the world at large. When Jill confronts her about her elves' behavior, Rosine gaslights her by saying that all they were doing was imitating the humans. She then mocks Jill for being a cowardly human as well, and then says that all of that will change as soon as she accepts the deal. Rosine also uses the fact that their village was in a war-prone area to ask Jill if she really wanted to go back there, and the promise of turning her into an extra special elf had nearly cinched it for her until Guts stepped in. What followed was a one-sided child massacre worthy of Anakin Skywalker himself, as Guts burnt down the emergence grounds and every other elf that wasn't Puck inside of the Misty Valley. The fact that a pseudo's body returns to its original form after their deaths made Guts the Holy See's primary target, because they thought he was mass murdering children. And in some part of his continually darkening head, Guts believed that as well. This is why it's a safe bet that the Lost Children arc will never be properly adapted cover to cover by any major studio, and if it isn't skipped over entirely, expect to see what we've just discussed to be heavily edited or outright removed. Marvelous verdict! But speaking of expectations, we hope we aren't letting you guys down, because that's all we got for you in this one. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.